Greetings and salutations, everyone. Today we're going to be taking a look at the origins of the Cold War, the time period that followed World War II and would carry right up until 1991, a time where the two great superpowers of the world were vying for control of the world and what that kind of meant for everyone caught in the middle. So the big thing to know before we get started with this is what a Cold War is. It is a conflict that does not include actual fighting between two sides. There's a lot of saber rattling between the two sides, a lot of angry pointing of fingers and sometimes of guns, but the two sides themselves never actually engage in the fighting. But let's get started. The origin of the Cold War actually started in World War II. February of 1945 at the Yalta Conference is where the question was drawn up, what is going to be done with Germany when all this is over? And we see that England and the United States, they won Poland, which had not existed prior to World War I and had been so quickly conquered at the dawn of World War II, to create their own government and choose their own way. But Stalin had already set up a communist government in Poland. The newly liberated European governments should be allowed to choose their own systems, like France, Czechoslovakia, Austria, even Germany. Germany itself would be carved up and occupied, but the Soviet Union wanted Germany for their own. They said, we are due Germany. We have lost so much fighting the Nazis. Stalin believed it was his by right. By July of 1945, with Germany now defeated and the fighting in Japan about to be over, there is the next conference, the Postum Conference. And this time we do see that FDR has now passed and he has been replaced by his Vice President, Harry Truman. Truman wants to revive the German industry, wants to make sure that Germany can come back as some kind of force to add stability to the region. Stalin is still convinced, no, it's mine, and I'm not giving it up. It is here that Truman informs Stalin about the bomb. Now, by this point, the Trinity test had already happened, and it is pretty widely believed that Stalin was already aware of what the bomb was from his spies. But now he's hearing about it from the American president. This really wasn't a threat. This was merely the statement that we have a weapon that can flatten a city in a day, in a second, and it's one bomb. Stalin didn't have anything to compare with that. He had a tremendous army, but nothing that could stand up to a nuke. Stalin agrees, and Germany will be partitioned. And you can see on this map that Germany itself is going to be divided between the Soviet part, the British, the French, the Swiss, and the American influence parts. And then right in the center of the capital of Germany, Berlin, that city itself is also subdivided. This partition will create the nations of East and West Germany. This is why the Cold War was so big. After World War II, there are only two superpowers left. England would spend the next 10 years trying to get their economy fixed. France, their government. Germany picking the pieces up. Japan, same story. There are only two left, us and the Soviets. We practice capitalism, they practice communism. We are a democratic republic, they are, for all intents and purposes, a totalitarian one-party regime. We could not have been more different, and we saw each other as so polarizingly opposite, it was a threat to our continued existence. And it's not just Russia when we say the Soviet Union. It's also the aligned nations that are nearby it. And this really kind of shows that when we look at Western Europe, this is a large area. We're not just looking at one nation versus many. We're looking at size of that one nation. Stalin made it clear that the territories that were his, that had been conquered during the war, were his, and he wasn't going to give them back. He did not demobilize the Red Army, and that army was twice the size of the American army. From a conventional land perspective, he had way more troops. The idea of, yes, but we have nukes, that's great, but a nuke will kill a city. Russia is the largest country in the world. It covers 12 different time zones. There's not enough, okay, there are now enough nukes, but you're going to kill the rest of the world if you want to try to nuke Russia like that. The American ambassador to the Soviet Union warned that Soviet ideology was actually more dangerous than the Nazis, because Nazi ideology appealed to nationalism, traditionalism, and racism. Soviet ideology appealed to nations that are poor, nations where the public had been under the heel of a strong government for a long time. And ultimately, Soviet ideology, or even communist ideology, could grow in more places than Nazism could. The American foreign officer George Kennan said, "The best way to fight communism will be to isolate communism, to contain communism." Kennan said that if the Soviets are not allowed to trade, not allowed to interact, not allowed to spread communism to other places, then they'll fall apart. They will starve themselves out. They'll snuff themselves out like a fire. That was the idea. Truman believed that this idea of containing communism was a great idea. And he rules out the idea that we are not fighting communism. We are protecting democracy. And this simple wording, for a lot of people, meant, oh, good, we're not fighting evil. We're just protecting what's good. And we like what's good. Communism, as I said earlier, is more likely to grow in nations that do not have money, that are economically poor, and usually have a bad political system. After the Nazis fell, we wanted to make sure that nations across Western Europe received financial aid, and that was what the Marshall Plan was. It was to introduce economic aid as well as stuff to Western Europe. The goal being, number one, those nations would remember who helped them out and our view on communism, and number two, if they were doing well, then they might not fall to communism at all. And one of those places that we did help out was Germany. The big problem started to arise with Berlin. The fact of Berlin was, western half of Berlin, the part that was capitalist, started seeing big recovery very quickly. The eastern half of Berlin did not. Stalin was worried because nowhere else in the world was there such a dramatic side-by-side comparison to what this aid would do as here in Berlin. And what he decides to do is starve out West Berlin. He closes every access road to Berlin. And he's in June of '48, and he says all the roads are closed. We're doing construction on all the roads going to West Berlin all at once. And so the Americans respond by saying, well, that sucks, but you got to do what you got to do. And we just start airdropping the packages into Berlin. We followed the air corridors that are highlighted here, and from June '48 to May of '49, every day, every hour on the hour, there was a plane landing in West Berlin, giving aid to anyone who needed it. And the fact that this kept going this frequently was one of the ideas that we were just going to keep doing this. And after, again, almost a year of this, the road situation miraculously is all fixed on the same day. And we're allowed to drive the trucks back in. Japan is put back together in a lot of the same ways. The guy who's given the title, what a fun title, Supreme Commander of Japan during this time was General Douglas MacArthur. He would oversee the economic reconstruction as well as donning the new constitution for Japan. Some of the stuff that it included was that the United States would be a protectorate of Japan, that we could have some forces on the Japanese homeland for a while, and that in the new constitution that would be drawn up, the emperor would still exist. He would not go to jail, neither would any member of the royal family, and that the imperial family could still exist in Japanese culture. And the emperor does still exist as a role in Japan, kind of like the Queen of England still exists, more of a figurehead role than any actual authority. Greece had some trouble with communism pretty quickly. In the early 20th century, Greece had been first under the control of the Ottomans. Then, when the Ottoman Empire no longer existed, they created their own government, which created a king and an oligarchy and a lot of people at the very top who had a lot of power, and not a lot of people liked that. And that led to a communist uprising. England was able to keep the Greek commies from taking too much power, but they were not able to do it for a prolonged period of time. And that's why we get involved. This was our first place that we fight communism. And again, this wasn't we're fighting communism, we were protecting democracy. The reason that we get involved in Greece was very simple. We didn't want Greece to fall. The fear was if Greece falls, then other nations nearby would fall too. This domino effect of communism would affect the entire Mediterranean. And we established a right-wing, conservative, military-dominated government in Greece. And they're going to maintain authority and autonomy and not fall to the commies. Truman then goes out of his way to say any nation that feels they're being threatened by communism, we're going to help. And this is just a big middle finger to the Soviet Union and Stalin. The next step in fighting communism was creating an international organization called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was a collection of nations that all agreed if, in the event, any power attacks any of them, the other 13 are going to come to their aid. And this included America, Great Britain, Canada, France, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Denmark, Norway, Portugal, Iceland, and since '49 it's even included a couple more. The Soviets saw this as a clear alliance, and we saw in 1914 alliances were one of the big things that made World War I happen. So Soviet Union and Stalin create their own alliance system of all the Soviet aligned nations and said exactly the same thing. The fact that we had nukes and they didn't was a big, well, it definitely helped us make any argument because, hey, we've got nukes and you don't. And we had nuclear supremacy for 4 years. We were the only nation in the world that had nukes until September of 1949, when the Soviet Union tested an atomic weapon. And they had stolen some of the information. They had spies who had get some of the information out. And very quickly the question was, okay, we have nukes, they have nukes, what do we do now? And Truman responds by announcing publicly that we were building a new type of atomic weapon called a hydrogen bomb. And hydrogen bombs are about 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb that, for instance, we dropped on Hiroshima. These things are so powerful that you need an atomic bomb just to start the chain reaction that detonates the hydrogen part of the bomb. They're really substantial weapon systems. China at the time goes through in the early part of the 20th century, they saw 3 different political revolutions. The old dynastic imperial system, the alliance between the nationalists and the communists, the nationalists who come to power, and then the Chinese communists who come to power. And boy howdy, China was in a whole mess of states when this happened. The Chinese nationalists are going to be ruled under by Chiang Kai-shek, and that's the guy on the left. And when the nationalists come to power, they kick the commies out of southern China, and the Chinese communists under Mao Zedong, the guy on the right, go into the mountains of North China. And it would have been like, and go there and ... die. But the nationalists were not able to hold the government or the state together. People are upset. They want to see another change. And this is when communist China will kind of take over. And this is where we get communist China. The nationalist government flees to the island of Taiwan, and communism will rule across China, and will do so for the next 7.5 decades. They're still communist today, by the way. After 5 years of containment, the Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, was put in charge of reviewing containment, saying, hey, is this thing working? Is this thing still worth it? And he came to the conclusion it is working for now. And if we want it to keep working, we need to spend much more on our military infrastructure. For us to remain the dominant military power in the world, we need to increase military spending to about $50 billion a year. And this is in 1950. This was when the idea was offered to Truman. Truman was appalled because, by 1950, we are not at war anymore. We are no longer needing the millions of forces and planes and bombers and all that stuff. He had been planning to cut the budget of the armed forces by $1 billion. Like, the armed forces would have a budget of $13 billion. Not like more than triple it. But again, that was the fear of communism, so we needed to maintain that authority. The same year that is awarded up, we have our issues with Korea. Korea had, before World War II, been controlled by the Japanese. After the war, Japan lost claims to the Korean Peninsula. It is divided in 2 parts, the north half and the southern half. The north half would be influenced towards communism. The southern half would be influenced towards democracy. And in June of 1950, North Korea attacks South Korea. And South Korea's forces, they put up a fight, they put up a struggle, but they just were completely caught off guard, and they fall apart very fast. And you can see on this map how quickly the Southern Korean nation fell. By September 10th, that was when we see that Allied forces are able to start landing and start helping the South Koreans. And again, on this map, you can say, wow, so the capital of South Korea and about 80% of South Korea had been conquered. Yes, my friends, you are correct. Truman takes this problem to the UN Security Council, and we see that the United Nations is going to deploy troops. Now, we couldn't send troops to Korea without a congressional approval. So Truman going to the UN gets boots on the ground and circumvents Congress at that time. MacArthur is put in command of the troops, and this is the same guy who had been governor of the Philippines, who left during when the Japanese started approaching, and had been supreme commander of Japan for the past couple of years. So he definitely was a seasoned tactician. And we start covering ground, retaking ground very quickly until we get to the 38th parallel, the original border. And the question is, well, okay, we have pushed the North Koreans out of South Vietnam. What do we do now? And the answer was, well, let's just keep going. I mean, they're commies. They attacked first, so let's just push them off. Let's conquer North Korea. And we start doing this and we get to almost North Korea's border with China. And it looks like, well, North Korea has been defeated and we'll have an entire Korean peninsula united as one until China shows up. On November 26th, China attacked. They had sent 33 divisions across the lines. And you have 1.3 million Chinese pouring across the border, facing off against 300,000 Americans. And American forces, you can't fight numbers like this, especially in a peninsula as small as Korea. It's like the size of Florida. So the American forces fell back because that really is the only direction you could go at that point. Truman, this goes very bad for Truman as MacArthur first. MacArthur says we are going to lose and writes to the president saying, I need access to nuclear weapons, and he wants a dozen nuclear weapons to end the war. And when you consider that it took only 2 nuclear weapons to end the Japanese Empire, the fact that MacArthur wants over a dozen of these things is a appalling amount of firepower. And Truman says, no, we're not going to escalate the war this much. Afterwards, MacArthur is removed from command because he takes that news and he says some extremely unflattering things about the president, his boss, and is then removed from power. The communists agree on June of '51 that there will be an armistice, a ceasefire, not a peace treaty. And that ceasefire had been in effect for the next 7 decades. Following World War II, following World War I, lots of different nations across the world who had helped out an imperial power had been told, hey, if you help us win, we'll help make sure you get your freedom. And when that didn't happen, we see a real push for more decolonization. Hyper-nationalism starts to appear. And some of this, like, for example, in India, that's Mahatma Gandhi. He led hunger strikes and nonviolent protests in India to get the British to leave, and it worked. Back in the States, Truman has a big question of what do we do with the economy? And the question is very simple. I mean, we had been in the Great Depression before this, then it was the New Deal, and now we're at wartime production and we're building everything possible. And the Fair Deal was meant to be the transition back into a normal economy, one where the government is not doing as much for the people, for the workers, and that business could take care of business. There was a big fear of how this was going to go, because if all that aid money just disappeared overnight, the real fear was that we would slide back into another Great Depression immediately. However, that's not what the case was. During the war years, there had been price controls on everything. There had been ration controls on everything. There had been limits on what you could buy. So even if you're finally making good money, you couldn't buy something you might really have wanted. But now that the war is over, you could. And for companies that were making wartime goods, it was real easy to just switch to peacetime versions of it. General Electric goes from making bombers to making refrigerators. Ford goes from making Jeeps to making trucks. And when it was something you couldn't have and now you can, people jump on it. It is the beginning of the era of abundance. For the soldiers, they had a huge impact. In 1944, before the war even ends, the GI Bill of Rights is passed, and this is going to provide transition for soldiers, for veterans, saying that, if you served, then you could get an education. The GI Bill would be available to you. If you wanted to go back to school, you could get a trade. The military will pay for that. If you want to buy a house, if you need money for a car, cheaper loans, better options. That was the idea of it, keeping the economy moving. Truman came to the office of the presidency when FDR passed away in 1945. By spring of 48, he runs for presidency. And he had started losing some favor among some of the other political groups. Republicans are going to nominate Howard Dewey. He's depicted there on the right. There are some folks who say that, two of FDR's own sons said that General Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander in Europe, should get the Democratic candidacy. And more people were looking at Truman and saying he was not a good peacetime leader. If you were a betting person, you would not have bet on Truman to win in 48. But he did win in 48. He won the popular vote by 3 million votes. And I love this picture because, now in the 21st century with electronic voting, we know who the candidate is that day on election night. The Chicago Daily Tribune started printing that Dewey had won in their evening edition because it looked like Dewey was going to beat Truman. And, here Truman is accepting, hey, we won, and he holds up that picture that, so much fun. Following the war, we see that African Americans see a real new step in prominence. There's big civil rights movements that happen for this group that happen very quickly, then they all stop again. One of the big steps for the post-civil rights was Jackie Robinson. And in 1947, he is picked up to play baseball for the Dodgers. And this was enough of a thing that, it had never been done before. He was the first African American to play Major League Ball. And it was the start of a new way of things. There was a lot of laws that were passed during the war for African Americans and factory life. For example, Executive Order 9908 said that if you wanted a federal money, then you needed to not discriminate in your hiring process. In June of 48, Truman announces that the armed forces will be desegregated. There will no longer be the white units and the black units. There will no longer be white officers leading black troops. It is just, these are the soldiers who are protecting this nation. There was a great fear of communism during the Cold War. I think I've stressed that plenty by now. But larger than just the commies that are in Russia, the commies that are in Greece or China, there was also commies here in the United States. And There was the National Workers' Party, there was the American Communist Association, and in 1947, Truman establishes the Loyalty Review Board that was designed to check on government employees and make sure that they were, quote unquote, loyal to the United States. And if you were sympathetic to communism, if you believed in the idea of Marxism, then you could be fired just for that. And over the next 10 years, 2,700 people are just going to leave instead of anything else. The fear of communism was so great that in February of 1950, the Senator of Wisconsin, Joseph McCarthy, he says that there's even communists in the State Department, and he had a list of every member of the State Department who was a communist. And people were so scared of this that the House of Un-American Activities Commission was created. And if these guys called you in, then it usually did not end well, because you're going to be interrogated. And it might be public with a camera. It might be private, like in a police interrogation room. And they're going to ask you questions that might begin with, okay, so do you believe in communism? Okay, have you ever read the Communist Manifesto? To who is the first president of the United States? Or even more absurd ones, like, what's your favorite color? What's your favorite food? And this usually ended with, okay, it doesn't look like you're a communist, but you're definitely going to remain on our radar. And if you surrender the names of any other potential communists, then we won't carry this any further. And if you were scared because, being labeled a communist could cost you your job, it could cost you your community, it could cost you what church you might go to, you'd become a pariah for this. So people would just name names if they thought that could get them out of this. And A-list celebrities were accused. General Marshall, the same General Marshall the Marshall Plan is named after, is accused. High-ranking individuals are accused, and there was never any evidence for anything. But the fear was so staggering, it kept it going. Finally, the NAACP was concerned of communists so much that they feared communism over individual civil rights. The Cold War caused a shift in how these groups thought and how these groups acted, and fear of what was coming was always there. So much so that it's going to dominate the public sphere for the next couple decades, and foreign policy for the next 40 years. So, today we took a look at the rise of the Cold War and what happened because of it. Hope you learned something. I'll see you next time.